Yeah, all right. So, good evening, everybody, to our Digital Humanism lecture series, third in this year. Without a further ado, I just introduce our moderator of today. We are very happy to have you, Helga Novotny, here today as our moderator. So many of you know Helga. Has been professor at the ETH Zurich. She's a founding member of the European Research Council and also has been president of the ERC. She's member in several councils, boards, which I do not start to enumerate here. She received several awards, including honorary doctorates from the University of Oxford and the Leibniz Medal from the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. She has published several books, and as I said, without further ado, we are all looking forward to today's lecture. I just hand over to you, Helga.
Thank you, Stefan, and a special welcome to everyone. Good afternoon and good morning to our guest, Sayeed Choudhury. And I have the pleasure of introducing Sayeed. Sayeed is the Associate Dean for the Digital Infrastructure and Director of the Open Source Programs Office at Carnegie Mellon Libraries, and an affiliated faculty member of the Block Center for Technology and Society and the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, as well as Executive Director of the Open Forum for AI. I could go on because he has been and still is extremely active in several boards, a member of the Open Source Initiative, a Human AI Collective Advisory Board. He was a President Obama appointee at the National Museum and Library Services Board and many other activities. So he brings a huge amount of experience to the topic. But most important of all, and this is why I thought it was a good way of introducing Sayeed and his activities to the Digital Humanism lecture series, is that he has been active for open source AI and the forum and the activities starting in February 24, so it's almost 2 years ago. With this emphasis on the imperative to advance a framework of open technology stack for AI. And I would like to give the floor to Sayeed. We, as usual, have about 25 minutes for listening to you, and then we engage in a discussion. And as I just heard, Sayeed came back from Delhi. I have questions about Delhi, and I'm sure you will also have many questions to what Sayeed is now going about to tell us. Sayeed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helga. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with all of you, and I do look forward to a discussion. Let me go ahead and share my slides. So I believe you should see the presenter mode for slides at this point. I am going to be speaking about the imperative of openness in AI, and I'm assuming that this is a group that I don't need to do a lot of convincing about the value of being open, whether that's open data, open source software, open source AI. But what I do want to add to that layer is a sense of urgency that I'm beginning to feel and the rationale behind that urgency. So I will begin by showing you a slide that I will come back to at the end. And this is a figure from a report that was produced in February of 2024 by a convening that happened at Columbia University in New York City that was co-sponsored by the Mozilla Foundation. And it is a very useful framework for thinking about openness in AI. While it came about 2 years ago, I think it still offers a very good conceptual framework for thinking about AI openness in a broad sense, not only the foundation models, but the entire type of AI stack. I do think there are some things that have happened in the ensuing 2 years that prompt us to revisit this, and I'll come back to those points near the end of my talk. As Helga mentioned, I am leading something called the Open Forum for AI, or OFAI. It is an academic and non-profit-led program that aims to bend the arc toward more human-centered, responsible, transparent, and ethical AI. As I mentioned, I'm the Associate Dean for Digital Infrastructure. My research has been focused on the development of digital infrastructure. And if you look at the internet and the web, one thing that was important is a balance between the triad of academia, industry, and government. So in many ways, the OFAI is trying to restore that balance. I think as we've moved from the internet to the web to AI, the role of the private sector has grown exponentially. And when I say that, people immediately think, oh, are you being anti-capitalist? No, it's none of those things. It's just, I do think having a balance of those different sectors who have different missions, different stakeholders, different expertise, different perspective has been very useful for the development of digital infrastructure. And we believe the same thing is true for AI. We are organized into working groups. So while many AI programs you may hear about go very deep on particular aspects, whether that's safety, evaluation, performance testing, benchmarking, so on, we believe a holistic approach is necessary because if AI is indeed becoming infrastructure, infrastructure is a multi-dimensional, socio-technical type of development effort that requires research. It requires prototyping based on that research, so we can do early iterations of technology deployment and evaluation. Those ultimately feed into policy recommendations. We have policy experts based in the US and in Brussels. So we're tracking, at this point, state-level legislation in the United States, but also the EU AI Act. Thinking about talent and workforce is critical. The human dimensions, of course, there's questions about what AI might do to jobs, but also how to equip people better to learn about AI, to understand AI. The OFAI network is the community engagement platform. One of our latest examples is we are working directly with the community center in the city of Pittsburgh to hold AI literacy workshops. One of our newer groups is looking at data and AI. So some of the organizations that have been leading work in terms of data and AI, such as the Open Source Initiative that Helga mentioned, but Creative Commons, Common Crawl, Open Mind, the Alliance for Responsible Data Collection are all part of this working group. And then we also have a research library advisory group. I am based in the libraries at Carnegie Mellon. We believe that research libraries continue to bring a valuable perspective and input into this process. And then an exploratory technical group, which is basically setting up sandboxes. These are precursors to the prototypes that I described earlier. These are some of our university partners. This slide is out of date. As of next week, I'm proud to announce that Trinity College in Dublin will be our newest university member. So we will have a press, once that press release has been published, we will add them to this list. But you can see we have institutions even in the global south, BRAC University, and then in Europe, and then throughout the US, of course. These are the nonprofits we've been working with. You can see it's a fairly interesting range of organizations that bring different kinds of perspective and expertise. And then while we are very much focused on the academic and nonprofit sector, we recognize that there's value in interacting with the private and government sector. The way we do that is through these individual fellows. So they're not partner organizations, they're not even an advisory board, they're mainly sounding boards, ways of accessing different networks. And you can see quite a range, including big tech, including the US Navy, including a venture finance group. Our work is really fundamentally focused on this idea of an openness in AI framework. And it builds on the figure I showed you at the very beginning. It builds on the open source AI definition that is being stewarded by the Open Source Initiative. But ultimately, it's a comprehensive socio-technical framework. And one of the really important realizations in terms of infrastructure development research is it is a socio-technical framework. It's not just building technology, it's understanding the social context, its engagement throughout society, and so on. And we really want to think about moving from open source to open governance. And the head of our research group has a very nice way of thinking about governance, that there are multiple tools that one can use to think about the trajectory of AI, regulation being one of them, policy being one of them. But evaluation frameworks is another. Direct testing with communities is another. Research are all facets of open governance. So it's probably not, it's necessary in my opinion to think about things like open source, but maybe not sufficient. So we want to take that comprehensive view, particularly with the specific contexts and the specific questions around the W's that you see on this list. So I'm going to turn from OFAI in terms of the work we're doing and why I bring this particular perspective to more of a broader landscape analysis. And one thing we often hear about, and we did hear also in Delhi at the AI Summit, is this US AI dominance. And when people think about this, they typically think about this type of diagram, which looks a little bit like the solar system with ChatGPT being the sun and the planets aligned on the right. And this diagram is a little bit out of date. It's from middle of last year, but I suspect the trends are reasonably in place. That the most commonly used chatbot is still ChatGPT. But even at that time, you could see that DeepSeek had moved into a number 2 position, passing Gemini, and that there are other players who are roughly on that order of magnitude. But I think it's really important, and I'm sure this group knows, this is only one picture of AI, right? This is often what an everyday consumer in the United States might think of, but it doesn't take much to get much deeper than this picture of this sort of who's using chatbots. And it's also interesting to note trends that are happening more recently. Right? There's a noticeable drop in ChatGPT's market share from that time even until the beginning of this year. And you can see other models are growing, in particular Gemini, and you can again see the importance of DeepSeek and sort of the open source, if you will, open alternatives. And one place that I probably spend too much time on is Hugging Face. Every so often I go and I take a look at these so-called community boards. And this is literally from yesterday. So I assume it hasn't changed too much in roughly a few hours. You can see here, the top trending models according to Hugging Face. And you don't see any of those chatbot, AI systems on this list. And when I've said that, people have said, well, that's not fair because the systems aren't open. And my point is, is that a feature or a bug? if you're talking about what models are trending and they tend to be ones that tend to be more open, in many of these cases they come from China, then that's not a fault of these models and these platforms. It's a strategy. It's an intentional choice to be more open and therefore have more adoption, more interest, and so on. And on this list is NVIDIA. I don't know that model that well, but I did look at the links, and it appears to me that the data, the code, and the weights are available. And those conform well to the open source AI definition that is being stewarded by OSI. And then if you look at the most liked models, you'll also see a similar kind of list. But you do see on this most liked list Llama and OpenAI. So those do come from those big tech companies. But there's a really interesting arc that's necessary to describe in this context. There's a project in the United States called the Atom Project, American Truly Open Models. And it is basically urging the United States to invest more in research around open systems. And I will say that the premise for this group is competitiveness, right? Is how do American models compete in a globally gift system? That's not why I'm bringing it to your attention. I'm bringing you to your attention to say that there's an opportunity even within the United States to engage on more open approaches. And you can see the main question here. And the people who sign this some of them are from academia, but many of them come from the private sector. You can see the director of applied research at NVIDIA, CEO of Hugging Face, AI companies, former people from OpenAI. The big concern is exactly this, is that if you look at those 2 Hugging Face screenshots I showed you, that over time, there used to be this use of Meta and the OpenAI model that released its weights. But over time, those models are being surpassed by models that are coming out of China. So this raises this question of the US dominance, in my mind at least. And their analysis is actually based on Hugging Face. They do this very extensively, tracking Llama in particular, how for a while it was the most popular, it was the most trending, but that is changing, and how across the regions and the world, you can see how the rise of the use of these Chinese models. the rankings, but interestingly enough, the performance as well. So one of the points you'll often hear, and I heard this in India, is these models are not as performant. I'm not really sure what the basis is for people making those statements. I do think Hugging Face is a reasonable source to think about this question, and based on that analysis, I don't know that that's true. Another really important trend in this context is the rise of these small language models. Of this paper are from NVIDIA. So this is not your usual suspect kind of nonprofit saying that this is important, but rather one of the large technology companies in the United States is asserting that small language models with specific kinds of data, specific kinds of applications, combinations of those models, particularly if they're working with agents or being orchestrated by agents, may be more economical, may be more energy efficient, and may perform just as well, as these large foundational models. So this is a fairly major shift, I think, in terms of the initial narrative, if you will, might have been, here's this large foundational model called ChatGPT, which, mind you, when the first release came out and the paper was associated with it, they called it an experiment. They said, we're looking for feedback on what you think about this. And they reached 1 million users faster than any other technology platform. And I've stated this publicly before. I'll be honest, if somebody came to me and said, here's billions of dollars, can you build a general purpose technology out of this? Can you build artificial general intelligence and so on? I probably would have said yes. There's a lot of talented people in the world. And if we hire enough of them and get enough resources, we can probably figure this out. But it hasn't happened. And I think that's a really important point. And in Sam Altman's talk at the India AI Summit, he said 2 things he's been saying since the beginning of ChatGPT. We're very focused on safety, and we're just about a year away from the super intelligent AI. So maybe that's true because it's been some time, or maybe the diminishing returns, quite frankly, we're seeing with these large foundation models is actually catching up. And the smaller models, the agents, the open models, I think are in some sense a counterpoint to that. So I would like to shift to some discussions around the India AI Summit for obvious reasons. A large global event that just happened last week. So very much still on my mind. I'm still processing a lot of what happened there. There were many, many, many sessions, many side events. So I should be very clear in saying I do not pretend to comprehensively represent everything that happened at that summit. I can't imagine who would have been able to do that. But nonetheless, I was there for the week, and I had an opportunity to go to many of the events, the sessions at the main event hall, and then many side events as well. And I put up here the manifesto from Digital Humanism as a nice benchmark that I used in terms of looking at these different sessions and what was being said. And I will say that many of the sessions I invented prior to the main summit day on Thursday did address many of these questions. It did, in my opinion, think a lot about what we might think of as responsible AI, as more inclusive AI, more fair, equitable types of AI. India has a few official languages, but I'm told has hundreds of languages throughout the country, and may have thousands of dialects throughout the country. So there was a lot of discussion about multilingual support for obvious reasons. And one of the questions that often, or one of the topics that often comes up is this question of sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And I know that's important in Europe. I think one point I'd love to discuss with everybody is, are sovereignty and agency the same things? And if they're not, I think of agency more as having choices. Can I mix and match components? Can I swap them out as technology changes, as policy changes, as we discover things by testing and evaluation? Is there an interoperability that I can take advantage of? And I only mention this because I was on a panel organized, a virtual panel organized by the World Bank. It was Chatham House, so I can't tell you who the person was, but I can tell you somebody made an interesting point that what if we keep focusing on digital sovereignty and the end result is multiple national AI models? And is that a good outcome? Is that a desirable outcome? How many is the right number? What about countries that don't have the resources to build national AI models? But I was rightly reminded that this issue of language is really critical. So one of the reasons that countries, or maybe regions even, develop these models is to make sure that languages continue to persist and continue to be treated with the right level of respect and agency and so on. So I think it's an interesting question that merits some further discussion. I will say the one aspect of facets of the manifesto where I felt it was a little disappointing was the emphasis on academia, particularly because I am leading an academic nonprofit organization called OFAI. I was at a session where somebody from an Indian university asked, where is academia at this summit? Where is academia in these conversations? And it was disappointing to me, to be honest, that the panel's response tended to be, well, academia may not be as relevant now. And a lot of the progress we've had with AI is because of private investments, not because of public investments and so on. A couple of things I would say. I didn't get a chance to say this because by the time the microphone would have come to me, the session had ended. These foundation models are built on public investment. They are built on decades of research from academia. So the recent private investments are building on decades of public investment. So I do not believe that you can say this is a set of private investment that has led to this effort. And actually, you can make a plausible case that since the private investment has become more dominant, we are seeing these diminishing returns. So it almost feels as if the decades of public investment gave the initial burst and the enthusiasm and all the investments and so on. But now you're starting to see it diminish. And the other being that I understand there's a lot of discussion in the United States about reform of the university system. And I'm not here to say that it's completely unmerited. There probably are some things that universities could have done in that mirror gazing, sort of introspective way. But there's still tremendous capacity and expertise in academia that can be brought to bear on AI in a comprehensive way. Not only the performance of models, but all those facets I talked about at the beginning in terms of the working groups that we have. So I say this to mention that I think we have some work to do, quite frankly, in order to make academia more recognized as still being a vibrant, important part of AI, the AI trajectory. So a few other points I want to make about the first summit in the Global South. So I've often talked to people about this concept of I don't know if I'm pronouncing this properly, the Yushi circle, where 50% of the world's population lives within this circle. It's not that big, actually, on the globe. It includes India, of course. So we had a summit in the Global South, and there was a lot of conversation around that. And I think based on the sessions I went to and the things I've read, India is really trying to cast itself in some ways as being the leader of the Global South when it comes to AI. And there were representatives from countries, throughout the Global South. There were sessions focused on that. But again, as I said, I didn't have a chance to go everywhere, so I may have missed it. But I learned about this particular project at the AI for Good Summit in 2024, actually, in Geneva, Amini, which comes out of Kenya. And this is a AI platform that's being built in the Global South for the Global South, with sovereignty around their data. It's being used by 25 countries, 25 plus. I don't recall a mention of this. And this is the team, that's working on that platform. So I would have hoped that there would have been more representation, for these kinds of really important developments coming out of the Global South. By Thursday, and this is a picture that has gone viral, so to speak, the main day of the summit was held with all the VIPs and the luminaries and so on. And this picture was a moment when Prime Minister Modi asked everybody on stage, and mind you, I don't recall seeing nonprofits, academics, civil society organizations on this stage, but rather, the Google CEO is also in this group. He asked everyone, to put their hands together as a show of cooperative development of AI. And I've read that this was a major emphasis of Prime Minister Modi's vision for the summit, is that India can provide this global blueprint that we can well work together to cooperate. So in that light, I'll just say it's a little bit disappointing that there was such representation from these large tech companies, but maybe not others. But what you might notice is Sam Altman and Dario Amodei are not holding hands. Very clearly, they're standing next to each other. They're not holding hands. Maybe a bad juxtaposition. Maybe they should have had them apart on the line, but nonetheless, this is the picture that went out and people noticed this immediately. I haven't read any statements about Amodei's response. Altman apparently said, I wasn't really sure what we were supposed to be doing. But with his right hand, he's certainly holding, Modi's hands. So at least half of him knew what he was supposed to be doing. And I'm not trying to be facetious or disrespectful. This is a large summit. It's an enormous challenge and a logistical nightmare. I get it. But it is an interesting symbolic moment that when you're calling for this inclusive cooperative approach, you have these individuals who literally won't even hold hands for a few seconds, few minutes, to convey that they will work together. And if we are looking at AI becoming infrastructure, infrastructure needs to be public. It needs to be for the community, by the community. And mind you, public infrastructure has generated tremendous amounts of innovation and private sector profit and economic growth and so on. I'm not opposed to any of that. But it was just a somewhat stark juxtaposition to see this being one of the final images that came out of that summit. And building on that theme, this is a screenshot from Gary Marcus's Substack blog. And he is citing an analysis in the Washington Post about how much investments are going into these, by these companies and into these companies for capital expenditures, data centers, investing in each other. There's a lot of the so-called circular investing happening. And one number I heard at one of the sessions is, over the next decade, $2 trillion of investments by these companies in capital projects, by these companies in each other. And right now, annual revenues of $50 billion for AI. That math does not add up. I don't think you need to have, an accounting degree or something to realize that's a very stark difference in numbers. And what I will say is, I worry, if that's the right way of putting it, that in essence, we're setting up these companies to be too big to fail. So if you recall the financial crisis in the 2009 period, that was the argument made to publicly bail out subsidized large banks. They're too big to fail. And I think that we may be starting to see that happening with some of these companies. And all the more reason why I come back to this diagram and say that it's really important to have an open alternative. And I think that this framework provides a pathway for that. Since the time of that convening at Columbia University, there has been the rise of the smaller models. There has been the rise of the agents. That's a really important development to keep in mind. There are other engineering developments that have happened in those 2 years that prompt me to say, we can actually start to think about building this stack. We don't need to just conceptualize it. One of the things that we come out of Carnegie Mellon is an LLM gateway called DARE, which would be open source, and it's providing a lot of interesting kind of agency, creativity, autonomy for people using AI so that you start to learn about it instead of just consume it. I would love, for example, to see that built on top of ETH Zurich's model. I believe it's called Openness. So we can start to put components together. And then the last thing I'll say is that we can look at the full stack. One of the sessions I went to was looking at open hardware. So not necessarily open hardware for a 500 million parameter model, but imagine an 8-10 billion parameter model that you can run on your mobile device. Maybe that can be run with open hardware. One presenter made the point that as we start to potentially revisit the architecture for AI, transformer architecture, unsupervised training, reinforcement learning, are we in fact starting to see diminishing returns? And if we start to think of different kinds of architectural approaches, we may need different kinds of hardware. And can that hardware be open? So I think that there's a real opportunity to do this work from an engineering perspective. OFAI is very keen on holding a series of workshops to make this happen. And I think that there is an imperative in the way that what we saw in terms of the messaging from the India summit. There was a non-binding agreement that 89, I believe, organizations or countries have signed, including the US. But I will note, safety is not mentioned in that agreement. Security is, but it's industry volunteer-led efforts. It's balancing innovation and so on. So to me, there's an imperative at this point. This is no longer a question of should we be open? Open is valuable in this way, so on. Of course, I believe that, but I think we have an imperative to show people what this kind of stack and what this kind of system might look like. So I will end by acknowledging the funders for OFAI because their generous support has made all this work possible. And I believe we have a good amount of time for questions and discussion. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Sayeed. When we started to discuss of you joining here, we postponed the date, as you will remember. But
Yes.
of course, none of us had an idea that you would just come back from Delhi to report to us. So thank you also for doing so. I want particularly to highlight a few moments in your talk and your emphasis. I think, and I'm speaking now from a European perspective, because very often we look only at the US, and it's, as you rightly said, the US dominance, and all the problems we have in fighting against the large corporations, having the AI Act, etc., Trump threatening and blackmailing Europe for doing what we think is right, etc., etc. But we don't very much have a look at what happens in the rest of the world. Of course, we realize DeepSeek was a shock to everyone because it came completely unexpected. But since then, it sort of faded into the background. So I think it is very important also from a European point of view, to keep this kind of opening, what is happening in the rest of the world. Then I found it very interesting and very significant that you put so much emphasis on the public side. I have mentioned this a number of times, how lopsided the financing is between public and private. If you look at R&D financing, usually in OECD countries, 2/3 come from the private sector because development is done in companies, etc. But for AI, it is 90% versus 10%. So this puts universities into a very disadvantaged position everywhere, not having access to the models, not having access to computation as they need, and also, training and educating young people who then leave as early as they can because they get these big salaries. So how can we bring in the public? And by public, it's really about AI as a public good, something that should belong to everyone, to benefit everyone. And a last point, then I shut up, is that I also found it very important that you emphasized, how far can you go with digital sovereignty and similar concepts. It's understandable. People want to know what happens to our data. We have our, identity, language, etc. But, if we overdo it, indeed, as you say, we end up in a complete mess where you have operability, recedes somewhere to the future, and we have nothing of this. So thank you very much. This is just a bit of input, and I see that Erich Brem raised a hand. Please help me with hand raising because I don't see everything, but I start with Erich and then I move on to Moshe.
I think Moshe was first.
Moshe was actually first.
Somehow
Okay,
the order is not sweet.
so let's start with Moshe then. Moshe, where are you?
I'm here. Yeah.
Good.
So thank you, Sayeed, for this broad overview of what's happening in the open area. But I want to ask about a specific aspect of open source, because this model can be used also for nefarious applications, cybersecurity attacks, perhaps design of biological weapons. It's a very, very powerful tool. Should we really make it open?
Yeah, it's a very good.
Do we want North Korea to have access to these models?
Right. No, it's a good question. It's a fair question. A few thoughts I've had about this question. Much of it based on the experiences we've had around open source software. And I will fully recognize and acknowledge that an AI system is much more complex than a software system. So it's not a perfect mapping by any means. But I think there's been a similar kind of questioning for open source software as well. Should we make the code available because it can then be used, by adversaries? It can be used for nefarious purposes, as you point out, and so on. In the US, the Department of Defense, actually, and I met the person who wrote their software policy, has a posture of open by default, which was a surprise to me. I thought if an organization that might be worried about transparent access and to software would be the Department of Defense. But apparently the thinking is that, number one, anywhere between 96 to 98% apparently of all software has an open source component in it, and 80% is released as open source. So you're eliminating access to a tremendous amount of assets, resources, capabilities. Number two, the flip side, if I can put it that way, of being open is that you can actually inspect it in a way that you can't with proprietary software. So we've had outages in the US for Amazon Web Services, for CrowdStrike, and so on, and that has cascaded throughout the entire economy and the entire society. And essentially, we are told we had a problem, we fixed it, everything's okay. We have a very famous case that did not happen in the open source software world of a vulnerability called XZ, which we believe was actually done by a state actor, but was caught by one of the committers of the program of the project when he ran it and said, there's something odd, it's not compiling properly. Let me go look and see if there's something that I don't think should be there. And he discovered it and stopped that vulnerability from being spread. Many years ago, I owned a car where I received a letter telling me you must bring in your car to have its airbags replaced. And I asked the dealer, I said, what's going on? Has this been safe? What's the problem? And they said, no, it's fine. It's totally fine. It's a routine thing. And here we'll give you a free oil change and everything will be fine. And I mention these stories because I think ultimately it comes down to trust. Are we trusting a proprietary vendor to do the things we need them to do? Or do we trust a community that backs an open source platform to do it? Now, of course, with AI, yes, I can use it to think about building a biological weapon, for example. I can do that with the open web. Anthropic and other companies have done this presentation. And one of the things they say is, well, it's so much easier with AI than it is with an open web search. I certainly don't know how bioterrorists think, but my sense is if you don't get the answers you need with your first 2 or 3 web searches, you keep going. You don't just stop because it's hard. So again, I'm not trying to be dismissive of that concern. It's a serious concern, but I would argue you can do the same thing with a closed system too. Are you able to take an open, system of AI and tune it and configure it to do something differently? that is something you can't do as easily with a proprietary system, right? So that's the kind of thing where we absolutely would want to do as much evaluation and benchmarking of what happens if I tune this, turn that off, change this setting, and so on. It's not an easy process. It's not a trivial process. Who do you trust to do that? Who's the third party you trust to do that? Those are really important questions. But I mention all this just to say I think it's a perfectly valid and important question. I think there are some nuances there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Erich?
Sayeed, many thanks for your talk. It was really insightful and very good to hear also about the breadth and depth of the initiative. I'm quite impressed with it and looking forward to having you in Vienna later this year. Now, my question is a bit mundane. Sorry for that. Can you tell us a bit more about how you're actually organized, how it's funded, and how you found obviously so many people who are keen on working on this? Has this been difficult? Is it mostly academic? Or maybe a few words about this would interest me. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I'll start with your last point in that it isn't difficult to find people to work with because there are many people who care about this issue deeply and believe that openness is an important strategy and an important approach to address many of the important questions that are being raised here, raised at the summit, and so on. We began by, so I also lead the open source programs office at Carnegie Mellon. We began by reaching out to our fellow offices throughout a network of university OSPOs, and that formed the first group of institutions that came together. I sit on the board of the Open Source Initiative, so it was an easy way to reach out to the nonprofit sectors in that way. And OSI is very well connected, of course, to other kinds of nonprofits and civil society organizations. So that was a very useful gateway into that community. But I think basically what's happening now is the way that, so I should be very clear that we've not formed a legal entity, and that is by design. Because as soon as you have a legal entity, you have legal agreements, which can take time
Costs.
develop and costs. So literally, in order to join, you basically would have to identify someone to be on one of the working groups or work with one of our technical prototypes, for example. So I'd mentioned ETH Zurich is on my mind. That if ETH Zurich we'd be thrilled to have them join. They could either say we want to work on the research group or the data group, or we want to integrate DARE with the Pertis as a very tangible type of asset. So it really is what work is of mutual interest to us and the partner we're looking at. That's what happened in Dublin when I went and spoke to Trinity College. We identified a few key common areas of interest. That's the model we're using right now because we want to be very nimble and we want to move quickly because, of course, AI moves at lightning pace.
Thank you. I see Anna's hand. Anna?
Yes, thank you, Said, for a very interesting talk. I have a question for one of your slides. You mentioned a recommendation on education in this sense, to educate, to have more curricula that are interdisciplinary between the engineering sciences, social sciences, and law, etc. We're very interested because we are designing a curriculum at this moment here in Europe, and we run into many problems also because of it's so difficult to get such a curriculum running. Do you have already experienced this in the US?
Yeah, I would say we're probably in a similar spot, that we've recognized the value for it. We recognize some of the potential disciplines or communities we'd like to reach into, but it's hard in the, I'll say, traditional academic framework to basically come out of a departmental silo, right? But the way we're thinking about it is, as I mentioned, infrastructure development being socio-technical, right? It's never simply throwing the technology at it. While I'm emphasizing engineering in my presentation, I think because we've made quite a bit of, we've gone far down this pathway without having this sort of more community-oriented engineering perspectives. But infrastructure doesn't develop, cohere, and get adopted because of the technology, right? It happens because of the social context and the community reactions and the politics and the economics, right? So we're trying to take lessons from these previous infrastructure development efforts that have been successful and say, these are the perspectives you need. And therefore, how do we introduce that curriculum? So the talented workforce group that I'd mentioned actually has developed a curriculum, and I'll find the website address and put it into the chat, that is aimed at building up AI competency for public sector employees in the US. And it takes this more systems engineering. So my background actually is systems engineering. It takes this more systems engineering approach where you have multiple objectives. Some of them are technical, some of them are social, some of them are economic. And you have different weights and you have different constraints and so on. So the first step we've taken is to publish that curriculum for anyone to see what kind of courses, what kind of expertise you need. And then you can start to map that to individual departments and programs.
It's a good example of open source in a way.
Exactly.
Alison Stanger.
Yes, Sayeed, great to see you. Looking forward to talking more in the future. I have two questions. I thought that was a great talk, by the way. Just
thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. The first question is, I wonder whether you have an answer to the difference between open AI and public AI. Are these overlapping concepts? Or, I think that's really interesting. And relatedly, the second question is, when you think about a public AI infrastructure for democracies, right? That's the way I think about it, because for a variety of reasons I won't get into it because this isn't my talk. Do you think it's dangerous to do it as a public-private partnership? Have you thought about that at all? That question. Given your dealings with both private sector and universities and public civil society organizations.
Yeah. No, good questions. The first one, open and public. One group that I spoke with fairly extensively and actually caught up with one of their members in India is the Public AI Network.
Yeah.
And we've had that conversation. Is open the same as public? And if not, what are the differences? What's the Venn diagram and so on? One point I would make in that context is it's possible, certainly, and we've seen examples of this, to have open source software development without the public involvement, right? You can get a bunch of companies that come together and produce open source software. And in essence, they're providing the governance for it and so on and so on. So that's a case where it's clearly not public, but it's open. Are there cases where something is public and it's not open? I'd like to believe no.
Yeah.
I'd like to think, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, right? So I live in Baltimore City, and we, like many cities in the US, are seeing skyrocketing costs for gas and electric bills. And there's lots of public hearings around this. How many people go? I don't know. I know some people go. I know not everyone in Baltimore goes. I don't go to all of them, but I can. Anytime I want, I can. And in fact, I can inspect the bids that are being submitted by companies to the Public Utilities Commission. Would I even understand the bids? Probably not. But the fact that it's public is really, really important, because there are people who understand those things. There are experts, and there are organizations, they're typically nonprofits. There could be competitors, private competitors, who want to see these bids, right? So I think that you can potentially have an open, AI model that isn't publicly governed. But I think if public AI, particularly as infrastructure, is closed and opaque, I think that's a problem. I think it will have some effects that some of them may be productive, but some of them may be counterproductive. And then there's no clear pathway to remediation, right? In terms of the public-private partnership, I do believe that for the internet and the web, the academia, industry, government triad was useful. I do. For example, at least in the US, the private sector is typically good at that last mile problem, right? Universities may develop a really good technology, the government may fund it and foster it and so on, but you don't probably want a university providing the service to the direct consumers. So there are benefits to each of them. Each of the sectors has a different scope, a different mission, a different set of stakeholders, and that diversity can be useful. But one thing that came up in India at one of the sessions I went to was exactly this point. He said, I believe in public-private partnerships. I don't believe in private public partnerships. So
That's
he
good.
was
That's good.
he was essentially pointing out the sequencing matters, right? Is it a private entity showing up and saying, "Hey, give me some public dollars," or is it the public saying, "We have a problem that's a last mile bandwidth problem. Can you help us solve that?" And is it a partnership or is it 80%, 20% public? So I think we need to keep those things in mind, that there are variances that are important.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just dropped the link to that curriculum we produced for Canada Workforce Piece.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see another hand raised, so I may benefit and come in with a question about Europe. How do you see the current, given all the imperatives and the urgency that you mentioned, how do you see the position of Europe? Because we in Europe, we feel really, we have been, partly our fault, partly because of other factors, we have been left behind regarding the technology. And then, of course, the cliche comes up, we over-regulate, we compensate and so on. On the other hand, the idea and the spirit of public, public openness, if I may combine these views, it's very strong and very strongly rooted in Europe for historical reasons, and also in terms of the way how, speaking about European values, I think this emphasis on public, like education basically is public. Much of healthcare is public and so on. So I see a lot of, contextual opportunities here. And also what is happening in Europe right now is we see some attempts of, taking on these small models and, trying to grow something. So I'm just curious, how do you see, also coming back from daily, with this global perspective, how do you see Europe, and what is it, do you have any advice for what Europe should do?
Yeah. I wouldn't say I have advice for Europe. I have some ideas that maybe might percolate throughout the European system. I'll begin with the question of regulation. The EU AI Act is clearly a major factor in the conversations. One of the reasons the US did not endorse the non-binding resolution that came out of the French summit was because it had, in the opinion of the US government, excessive regulation. I think about these sort of three regulatory efforts around data with GDPR, software with the Cyber Resilience Act, and now AI with the EU AI Act. I think that GDPR, whatever your opinion may be of it, was a success, right? This is a concern. We have our own data. Here's a mechanism that can be used to address that concern. And here's legislation codified into law, into policy, and so on. And the large US tech companies argued, oh, this is too onerous, we won't be able to operate in Europe. But they did, right? They adapted, they adjusted, and they did. That was a really important outcome and led to this so-called Brussels effect, I think is what it's called, right? That Brussels can come up with some legislation that will have cascading effects throughout the world. I think the one observation that I would offer, maybe in the context of conversations within Europe, is software is more complex than data, and AI is more complex than software. So if there is a belief, a premise that we can get to some point and be done, and then it can be actionable for people to implement, that will be harder to do with software, and it will be harder to do with AI. And I of all people, again, in this World Bank panel, Chatham House rules, I can't tell you who, I will just say they were from a venture finance group. So to give that context, she described regulation as clarity, which is a very interesting perspective I don't think I heard before. She said, I know people say it's, punitive and whatever. I just need to know how to operate, right? And she pointed out that having 50 different regulatory regimes in the US at the state level is a terrible outcome for a French finance person. They now have to do 50 evaluations for this company in each of those contexts. So that idea of regulation being clarity, rather than punishment, rather than, burden and so on, and how to make that clarity, a continuous process rather than a discrete one of we've resolved it. We did the legislation, it's been resolved. I think that'll be important for both software and for AI. Mm-hmm. I will say, so a book I'm just now reading, Digital Empires, it's what I call by Anu Bradford, talks about this market-based approach of the US, rights-based approach of the EU, and state-based approach of China. I think that's also a triad, right? Not any one of those approaches by themselves, I think, will come to a productive outcome. I think you need all three. So the next global summit is planned for Geneva in 27. I've been to Geneva only a few times, but my sense is it's a place where you can actually have all three perspectives together. And people don't say, oh, no, we can't talk about that. I heard about the International Geneva, the presence of the UN, the ITU, so on. So it seems like if we have roughly a year, can we think of that arc as Geneva is the place where we finally say, look, AI is global, infrastructure is global. We don't want multiple AI infrastructures. We didn't want multiple internets. We didn't want multiple webs. Can we please have all these perspectives in the room together? Because it really does need to happen. And it's not only about you investing in Switzerland or whatever. So I remain hopeful and optimistic that by next February we can have a very productive conversation.
This is a great way to end, to look to the future.
Excellent.
So thank you very, very much.
Bravo.
Thank you.
And now I turn to Peter, because you had a special wish concerning the music that we usually play in order to say bye-bye. And I look also forward to seeing you in Vienna again. Bye-bye.
Yes, very much so. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Helga. And I briefly have to tell a story. It's because Sayeed wasn't picking a specific track. He just said that for Vienna, waltz might be fitting. And I sought some inspiration from AI and gave his abstract for this talk to Gemini, not aware that this is now a feature basically to compose music directly. So it just gave me a track, or rather a sketch, and then a few more, and they were all awful. And I asked to combine these in the end and got the lyrics for what it called the Openness suite, which I then put to Suno, which is a music composition and generation AI, with the prompt to turn it into a waltz. So there we go. And yeah, that's where we are. I present you with some AI slop now. I'm sorry for that. It's not my proudest moment. The whole thing is a bit of a Disney version, I think, of Sayeed's abstract. Now after the talk, I kind of wish it would mention the AI Summit impressions as well, but I'm also sure we're actually happy that this is not going on forever. Before I play it, just the announcement of the next event on March 10th. Stefan Seider of Theowien will talk about what happens when LLMs are left alone, and Julia Neidhardt will moderate. Thanks, Sayeed. Thanks, Helga. Thanks to all of you for joining. My apologies for this, what's about to come. We won't do this regularly, but for now, enjoy it and have a nice rest of the day.
Columbia and Mozilla, a workshop of the mind, a framework for openness for all of humankind. Open technology stacks so what we're striving for, an imperative to build and then to open the door. The call for human-centered AI is at the fore, with transparency and access for us to explore. The EUA articles, a continental cry for digital sovereignty beneath the golden sky. We must advance the framework, make the open stack complete, a foundation for all nations, a future we can meet, for nations seeking digital command, with an open, human-centered plan.
But we lift our collective agency, building AI for all humanity.
Sovereignty
and agency,
a brand new work of art.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.